Konnichiwa! If you ever go for a job in the games industry, one of the questions you're likely to be asked is, what is your favourite game? This is a hard question to answer at the best of times, but in today's video, I'm going to be going through what my best game is for every single generation of console, from Generation 1 through to Generation 8.
Me. Oh, look at me, I work in the games industry.
Oh, fuck. That's right, in today's video I'm going to be looking at my favourite games from Generation 1 through to Generation 8. One of the great things about talking to you guys and about your favourite games is that every single one of you have some kind of nostalgic attachment to your favourite game. So for this video I'm going to try limit my best game per generation to one game, which is pretty hard because I have a real nostalgic attachment to a ton of games that we've got here. And whenever I have this conversation about what my favourite game is, I always struggle. There's no way I can kind of get it just down to one. Now, picking a single game for a single console is pretty hard, but picking a single game for a generation, this is going to be torture. So Generation 1, where it all began. And my first game, my best game for Generation 1, it's Tennis for the Magnavox Odyssey. Now, Tennis for the Magnavox Odyssey was actually just a variant of table tennis from Magnavox Odyssey. And what you did to get tennis from table tennis was to get a bit of plastic film, stick this over the top of your screen, and then that gave you the tennis graphics. And that was it.
To play Odyssey Tennis, you insert game card number 3 into the master unit. This activates 3 lights, 2 representing the players and 1 representing the ball. Press the special tennis game overlay into position on the television screen, and you're ready to begin an exciting, fast-paced tennis game.
Now, table tennis and tennis on the Magnavox Odyssey look very similar to Pong, and that's because Atari stole the idea of Pong from the Magnavox Odyssey and ended up spending tens of millions of dollars in compensation to Magnavox. Generation 2, and this is super easy for me, it's B-17 Bomber on the Intellivision. Now, B-17 Bomber on the Intellivision supported this. It's the voice synthesizer module for the Intellivision, and it allowed your video games to have realistic voices.
Mattel Electronics presents B-17 Bomber.
So all you needed to do was plug your game into this bad boy here, and then you could get voices from your video games. This is the size of some consoles now. The thing I loved about this game were the visuals, definitely. I was only a kid back then, and they were fantastic graphics for the time, but just the depth of the game, managing all the different gauges, your fuel, your altitude, your pitch, the horizon, then switching between the different guns and taking out enemy aircraft. So Generation 3, this is where things get a little difficult for me, but I'm going to have to go with Phantasy Star on the Master System for Generation 3. So I played a number of role-playing games before I came across Phantasy Star, but Phantasy Star was the first role-playing game that I played with my father. And I actually built out this little folder as we were playing the game. And this folder here has all the dungeons mapped out, and I sat down for hours next to my father mapping out the dungeons. Each square on this grid here represents one footstep, and I did every single dungeon, what you could find in every single dungeon, where you could find it, and we swapped. So my dad would swap over with me, and I would run around and kill bad things and upgrade the characters, and he would map out. But yeah, it was amazing playing this with my father. And then we even went around the world and mapped out the world, and again, every single square maps a single footstep, so it's a 1-to-1 scale of every single dungeon and every single world that you could visit and every single item that you could find in the world. Phantasy Star holds so many great memories for me. It really was my game of Generation 3. Or was it? I can't resist it. I also fell in love with The Legend of Zelda. This was the start of my love affair with the Zelda series. It was a fantastic game, and this is my most prized possession in my games collection. It's the first edition of The Legend of Zelda, signed by Shigeru Miyamoto-san. And whilst I'm breaking the rules, also absolutely loved Mario 3. Now, whilst Generation 4 had some of my most favourite games of all time on the Megadrive, Mega CD and on the SNES, my absolute favourite game for Generation 4 was The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. And there's some really cool aspects to this game that people have only recently discovered. In fact, I made a video about it, so I'll throw up a card in the corner over here. Generation 5 is pretty easy for me. It was all about PlayStation.
What about the Ocarina of Time on the N64?
While I was all about PlayStation for Generation 5, it was an N64 game that ended up being the best game of the generation for me. And that was The Legend of Zelda, The Ocarina of Time. The first open world sandbox game and one of the best Zelda games ever made. It was my all-time favourite game for Generation 5. Almost. Also on the list, Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, and the entire Wipeout series. It's Generation 6, and I'm not going to pretend. I've got a ton of games that were my favourite. Absolute favourite, Grand Theft Auto. Zelda Twilight Princess, and this game was amazing. The Unbelievable Halo, God of War, Ico, Katamari Damacy, Resident Evil 4, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, Final Fantasy. So things got carried away there in Gen 6, and Gen 7 isn't going to be too different. There was, though, a game that I played more than any other, and that is Littlebigplanet. So I was working at PlayStation when I first caught a glimpse of Littlebigplanet. It was a marketing video that was of this sponge world where you could run around, drag physics, and move into a 3D space. It was amazing. And from that point on, I was smitten. I followed the game's development, getting any kind of demo or release build that marketing managed to get their hands on so that I could have a go on it. And then when I took PlayStation home to GDC with Phil Harrison, I was absolutely thrilled to have Littlebigplanet on stage next to PlayStation Home. And actually, this was way better than the thing that I was making. I must have sunk about 500 hours into this game. I love this game so much, I managed to get a crown. So for those of you that know Littlebigplanet, you'll know that a crown is an extremely rare item to get. And I got it for creating this. This is my avatar in Littlebigplanet. So I modelled this out of clay, painted it up, and put it on the community blog. And yeah, I got a crown for it. But as with Gen 6, Gen 7 was just full of great games. Grand Theft Auto 5, Fallout 3, probably the only other game to come close to Littlebigplanet in terms of gameplay hours was The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Gears of War was my absolute favourite multiplayer game. The Uncharted series, and probably the best version of Street Fighter to come out, Street Fighter 4. So here we go, Gen 8, and at this point I should only have a stack of 7 games, and I've probably got about 30, so going well. Now Gen 8 is the current generation, and there have already been some absolutely fantastic games. Red Dead Redemption 2, which was only just released, God of War, The Witcher 3, Final Fantasy 15, Uncharted 4, Tomb Raider, and any one of the Forza Horizon games. All of them have been fantastic. But for me, there's one game that has stood out from the rest. Since its first iteration in Generation 3, and every generation afterwards, it has been an absolute favourite series of mine. And so for Gen 8, I got The Legend of Zelda, The Breath of the Wild. It's an absolutely stunning game, and again, I've put hundreds of hours into this game. It's brilliant. The systemic gameplay in it, the visuals, the control methods, the characters, the storyline, it's an absolutely brilliant game. And whilst the generation isn't over yet, Nothing has surpassed this for me. It's a brilliant game. And I guess some of you will argue that this is actually a Gen 9 game. It kind of depends on your point of view. Is the Switch a Gen 9 console or not? Regardless, at this moment in time, the game that I've absolutely loved the most is this. So there you go, my favourite games from Generation 1 all the way through to Generation 8. It's been an absolutely torturous experience going through my games collection, trying to decide on what my favourite games were for each generation. But ultimately I couldn't decide, and so I've ended up with more than 8 games here on my pile of best games. But for me that's fine. There's so many fantastic games out there. Going back to that original question that you get when you go into interviews, you know, what's your favorite game? So many games influence us, and so many of these games pull on our nostalgic heartstrings that I think it's almost impossible for us to choose one single game out of a generation of games. As always, it's been awesome to share with you my favorite games from my retro gaming collection. And if you want to see more games from an old video games developer, make sure you click on my little pixel head below. And whilst we're on the subject of generational gaming, why don't you check out this video here of my daughter trying to figure out how to set up a TurboGrafx 16.